Insurance agents from around the world, welcome to the Insurance Guys podcast. My name is Scott Howell, your fearless host and leader, insurance agency owner and insurance evangelist for I Protect Insurance and Financial Services, based out of Huntsville, Alabama. And before we get started on today's episode, please help me welcome. He is a 6'3" sophomore from Saraland, Alabama, parade first team All-American, Rivals 5-star recruit. He is a fantastic insurance agent and a great American. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand and welcome the incomparable Mr. Bradley Flowers. How are you, Bradley?
I'm great, Scott. How are you today?
Man, I am doing fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, I am in Mobile, Alabama, land of the free, home of the brave, and it is only 100 degrees outside right now. And it is so hot that every time I walk outside, it feels like I'm about to melt on the pavement out here. This is the hottest I think I've ever been. Just had a hurricane skim the coastline over here and went over towards Louisiana. Was it a tropical storm or hurricane? Was it?
It was a hurricane.
Hurricane. Yeah. Actually went up through Louisiana, and I think it's up in the Missouri area.
I wrote
right
more
now.
Insurance on Friday than I've written in my entire life. People wanting to buy insurance in the storm in the Gulf.
Yeah, we have had those situations occur as well, where a tropical storm, hurricane starts approaching, and about 2 days before it happens, we get calls from all over the place wanting insurance. And my favorite one, Bradley, is the people down here that probably called you and said, "Hey, man, I just want to make sure I got insurance. Now, is my policy good? We good? Everything good?"
We do a lot of that, and I do a lot of I second guess myself so bad when there is a disturbance in the Gulf.
Right, yeah.
I'm like, crap, did we do this?
Yeah.
Did we do that? And
is that on the policy? Is that endorsement on?
My God, you have no idea. And I told a buddy of mine the other day, like, we write good business. We really try to make sure we have the best interest of the client in heart, or we do have the best interest of the client. We're not worried about making the sale so much as we are taking care of the client multiple times a week. We tell somebody they need to stay where they are. But with that being said, I still like wake up in the middle of the night like thinking, oh my God, what am I going to do? And you know, I have no problem with a storm coming because I know our clients are in a good spot. Mm-hmm. But I told somebody the other day, I need the good Lord to give me a year in business before we have to deal with a hurricane coming straight to Mobile. I don't know that I can deal with the 2 months of not being able to write insurance because everybody has open claims.
Absolutely.
You know.
Absolutely.
So anyway.
Well, that is a beautiful segue into me introducing our guest today, because I've been researching him the way the Discovery Channel studies meerkats. And one of the things I heard on his last podcast, he talked a lot about culture. Culture in your insurance agency, which includes the types of people that you write, the types of clients you want, the types of individuals and businesses that you instill into your agency force as to what you want in the type of business that you want brought into that agency. And I've heard him talk about that. So without further ado, guys, I am super duper ooper excited to bring our next guest on. He lives in Fredericktown, Ohio. He is a graduate of the University of Akron. He has a beautiful wife named Heidi and a 14-year-old son named Ethan. He has been with Westfield Insurance. And guys, this is our very first carrier, our very first insurance carrier on the podcast. He has only been there for 25 years and currently serves as the distribution specialist leader. Going to have to get into exactly what that is with Westfield Insurance. He is also the host of Westfield Insurance's podcast called Closing the Gap, which is a podcast for independent agents that just celebrated their first year anniversary. Happy birthday to your podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand and welcome the other incomparable Mr. Chris Cline. How are you, Chris?
Hoo-ha, man, I don't even know how to follow that up. I just feel like we just end the thing right now.
My
podcast
back
is over.
My back is against a wall in the studio. I'm like, oh my God.
Guys, let me explain to you why Chris Cline is so important to be on this podcast. Number one, he represents an insurance carrier. Now, insurance agents from around the world, we are approaching how many downloads? 100,000? Is that how many we're at?
I don't even know.
Somewhere in that range. Yeah. Guys, listen to me. Very first insurance carrier representative that we've had on this podcast. But here's more importantly why I love Chris Cline. Chris has been doing this for 25 plus years, and I have studied him. I have watched some of his work. He has a very broad array of topics that he is able to talk about, and he has a ton of relationships in the industry. And I think we as agents probably need to do a better job of trying to understand the other side of the equation, which is that carrier side. Sometimes we have a tendency as agents to only try to understand our perspective on things without looking at the other side of the table. So, Chris, thank you again. I am humbled. I am honored. I am blessed to have you on this podcast today. It means a lot to me, and it means a lot to Bradley. Thank you for being here.
It truly is our pleasure and my personal pleasure. I mean, sitting in on a podcast that just finished up interviewing Gary Vee. I don't know how, I don't even know where I fit into that thing, but it's exciting and by all means, truly humbled by your introduction there and the kind words you've said. And I wouldn't even think we would be your first carrier. But then again, I mean, it's sort of unique. I know when we bumped into each other at Elevate, it sort of hit me that you guys are doing your thing and we're doing our thing, but right. We don't even sell P&C insurance in Alabama. Right? Hold on tight. But,
exactly.
I'm on the list to be the first.
Numero uno.
we had that conversation.
Yeah, I love it.
We did. I thought maybe you guys were just kind of positioning yourself and applying for an appointment. You know, grease the skids, talk about customer first. Sure, we're not here just to sell. We're here to take care of the client. Right. I think those are good. I think those are the right answers to some of the questions on our carrier interview guide.
Right.
Well, and I can tell you this, man. As an agent who deals with who's really been dealing with a lot of carrier reps in the last few months and a lot of carriers, the fact that you guys have a podcast is so indicative of a lot of other things that are all good for the agent. So, absolutely, as an agent, I really appreciate the fact that your company sees the value in that.
By the way, before you say anything, Chris, big boy right here is the one that's been listening to your podcast. And for all the agents that are out there, the podcast is called Closing the Gap, and it is a damn good podcast.
I listen to it too.
The guests that I've heard on there, and I've heard a few of them, they do a great job. You talk about a lot of things that are very germane to independent agents, and I would highly encourage our listenership to go out and actually take a listen to your podcast because you guys do a fantastic job.
Well, I appreciate that. I truly do appreciate that, and certainly for the props there. And I mean, the whole idea for us doing this podcast was, we might be about 18 months ago. It's a cold, crazy winter day in December of, probably the end of 17. In my role, and there's several of us here, a number of us at our carrier and at carriers around the country, spend a lot of time traveling the country. We're in agencies of all shapes and sizes, premium volumes, ages, models, the whole nine yards. And we're also plugged into a lot of different things in and around the industry. So I could be at any given state trade association meeting. I represent us on the Trusted Choice carrier board. So I'm meeting with peers and agents at that. Elevate relationships we have with third-party firms who do consultative work for agencies. And I was personally wrestling with, we're sitting on a lot of information, and every time I'm in an agency, they want to know, almost to an agency, Chris, what are the best performing agencies doing? What are agencies like mine doing? And you guys might even relate to this, but when a carrier is giving insight, I guess parenthetically, advice to an agency, I feel, and it's somewhat of a negative connotation, but sometimes I feel like that's viewed as though there's a carrier agenda or a carrier bias because all we want is more production.
Right.
And if I was to say, hey, call ABC consulting firm, they're good at this. Well, the consulting firm, I mean, certainly they want to help and they have great insights, but they ultimately want to sell an engagement. So I was kind of just reconciling how all these things come together and starting to listen to some podcasts. And I know all of us are sort of inside the original Hanley universe and, all the derivatives and all the folks that have been plugged into the work that the folks at trustedchoice.com and Elevate and all the folks that we've been able to meet through that network. So I've gotten exposed to some podcasts and I thought, there really isn't a carrier who is going up several levels, I guess, if you will, and using the insights, the education, the resources, the connections that we've made and sharing those with agencies in, I guess, a non-intrusive, truly consultative, trusted kind of way, in which that I'm not asking you guys for production. I don't even do business in Alabama. So,
Right.
But as we've seen this thing scale, that's really been the thanks we've gotten is you guys do have a lot of insight and observations, and you're sharing it in a way, you're getting folks on, you're sharing agencies who have had successes, agencies who've got skin knees, you've got consultants, you've got just all the different folks who are out there in the industry doing it. We're just trying to get them on the podcast and share stories.
So with that being said, Chris, of the agencies that you go out and visit, and as you said, you have different agencies that you go out and see that are all along that spectrum of success.
Yeah.
And we could even deep dive further into what is your definition of success. I could get into a 3-hour conversation about if your definition of success is being a $100 million agency. Okay, that's great. You want to be a $100 million agency? Good. Are you willing to have the type of sacrifice, the type of blood, sweat, and tears, and the blood on your sword that you're going to have relative to things that are going to have to be sacrificed to get there? Are you willing to do that, Mr. Guy that wants to be a $100 million agency? Sacrifices have to be made, in my opinion, in certain areas based on where you want to fall in that continuum of your agency and where you land as far as premium level goes. Now, that may all sound crazy for me to say, but I do believe it's true. My question to you is, when you go out and visit different agencies that fall along that continuum, what do you see as kind of a overall common theme within those successful agencies over and over again that you can give our listening audience an actionable steps to kind of emulate?
First thing I would say is a lot of the foundation for my answer and the work we've done in the industry is very much tied to some deep level of analytics. We and other carriers, I mean, certainly a lot of carriers do this to assess the health of their agency force. And we spent some time going back about a decade to flip the script a little bit and to look at data that is more than just an historical view of an agency's production, loss ratio, retention with us. And what are the factors that could be more predictive about an agency's success? And we've started to shape the way that we view the way we review agencies through that lens. And we've been iterative every other year as we revamp that approach. And so we've continued to refine that through data. And so this isn't just a carrier's or one person at a carrier's opinion. We're now about a decade in of having seen continued sustainable results, a very real separation from the top 10 or 20% agencies that we work with and the things they are doing that the other agencies are not. So that's the framework for the answer. And if you've listened to our podcast, you might have heard me reference the big three. It's kind of the framework that I use if I'm on a carrier panel or
I have heard you reference that, and I want you to explain that as well so our listening audience can hear that.
Perfect. Yeah, so the big three, they're very large, and I just like the number 3 because I think it's easy to wrap my head around. Right. And so I started to take all this internal observation, objective measurements that we have as a carrier, and things that we hear other firms that we work with talking about as leading best practices, and then our partnership with other trade associations. All this stuff lays on top of each other and tells a strong story that the big three, at least through the way I talk about them, the first one is this whole concept of talent acquisition and internal succession, which include things like things that are drivers of agency valuation, and ultimately, if you do want to sell externally, up through M&A. But it's that large grouping of topics. The other one is really around social, digital, and the customer experience, and really an investment in understanding what consumers' demands are and how they're evolving, and an agency willing to make the investments in them and to meet the customer when and where they are. And the other one is still a little bit, I guess I would say, hasn't matured quite as much, but there is a great deal of time, effort, and energy in the highest performing agencies in really wrapping their arms around data and analytics. So those are the three categories that really become offshoots or independent conversations. And so to a point you made is every single agency, whether they're at the top of the list or the bottom of the list and are closing the doors tomorrow, is somewhere on the continuum for all three of those categories. And nobody's pegged the needle on all three. Mm-hmm. That's what makes it cool, because there's always room to grow. So that's the setup, and we could take that wherever you guys wanted from there.
Well, here's where I want to take it. So Chris, you have to understand something. I barely scratched ninth grade. I am not very smart. I have the brain of a very small squirrel. So what I would like to do, and when I think about this podcast, and I tell our listeners all the time that reach out to us, I don't do this podcast. All I do is represent the 250,000 insurance agents that listen to this podcast. And the one thing I do know about them is the majority of them are just like me. They have problems in their agencies. They have weaknesses. They have different things that they need to improve. And so one thing I have committed myself to in 2019, and Bradley has as well, is giving these people simple actionable steps where they can turn off our podcast and go do something that day or that week to change the culture or change something that they're doing to improve their agency. So as I go through the big three that you just mentioned, my internal dialogue, again, not very smart, but every time I speak to you or anyone else, right now I'm obsessed with internal dialogue. You, Chris, say something to me, and whatever it is that you say, my internal dialogue is saying, floating that around in my brain, and then I'm hearing whatever it is I want to hear that you just said. So when I heard the big three, the first thing I heard, number one, talent acquisition. Now, to me, that means hiring great people or acquiring an agency that has a great book of business and great people in it. Is that kind of where you stand on number one of the big three? Is that what we're talking about?
It's certainly that's a great setup for that. Certainly acquiring an agency with great people is a way of doing it.
All right.
And there's a lot of agencies that have had success with that, finding agencies of similar culture or agencies they can acquire that they can migrate to culture with relative ease.
Right.
I personally, when I sit with an agency, I like to think about it in terms of straight, linear, organic. If you're going to do it yourself, if you're not going to think about, so you think about it in the context of a same store sale, what can you do here with the resources at your disposal to make the agency more viable? Because a lot of times, whether you're buying or whether you're selling, it's not uncommon to see whatever challenges or obstacles are constraining an agency today ultimately will manifest themselves post-sale or post-acquisition if they're not really thinking about them intentionally. So you've either solved for the problem or you haven't. And if you just add more premium to it and you're not really intentional about whatever it is you're trying to tackle, you've really just made it worse.
Right. Well, one thing I learned early on, and it's something that I don't know that I've really talked to Bradley about this at length or not. If I haven't, I should have. But, scaling a business is fairly easy. Bradley Flowers can go out and acquire an agency anywhere in the United States of America. The success or failure of that agency will be determined by two things. The people in that state that Bradley hires to run that agency, are they great people? Are they great insurance agencies? Are they passionate about what they do? That's the first thing you got to have. You got to have great people. And then number two, you've got to have, and this is the key to the whole shooting match, is to scale is great processes. Great processes that people understand and know how to do. That's why Chick-fil-A is able to build 500 stores all over the United States. They have great processes in place. If you don't have those great processes and you're flying by the seat of your pants, you can go down 3 blocks down the street and buy an insurance agency, and chances are you're either going to have to create those processes that allows that scalability, or that sucker's probably going to fail somewhere down the road.
It'd be hard to argue that. I wouldn't even try. I think you're absolutely right. I was just going to say, ultimately, if you're not thinking about processes and procedures, scaling becomes, you eventually get to the point where you're at a critical mass where you can't scale past that, because you've got to get to a level of efficiency that the operating margins are such that they can sustain investments in that growth. And whether you're trying to free up the capital to make an acquisition, which unfortunately today there's a little bit of ways to hide behind that because money's easy to get, money's cheap, and there's a lot of it floating around.
Right.
But that won't always be the case.
Right.
But if you are going to invest in fresh, organic, new talent, the mentoring, the coaching, and the onboarding that it takes to make somebody successful, that takes resource. And if you're going to invest in the internal culture of the agency, really trying to bring to life the core values and the mission that you're trying to elicit, again, as you were setting in your setup, to attract customers and the consumers or the talent at the agency, that takes a very intentional approach around the physical space, just the overall dynamics of that. And if every single dollar of your personal expense is being run through the agency, there's just no way the agency can cash flow those investments. Right. So it becomes stagnant. That's what happens, I think, in a lot of agencies. And folks that say they want to remain independent believe that right up until the point until they sell. And that's not my nugget. That's stuff I've learned. But you've got to be willing to take the hard look, run the agency like a business. And when you're doing that, the margins are there, the capital's there to make an investment back. And you've got to be able to look at it from outside your own lens. Yeah. And think about it. If you're a 25, 28, 30-year-old person coming through your front door, would you want to work there?
Right.
And so much has been said and written. And we had Tony Kanyas, the insurance nerd, was on our podcast earlier this year, and he spoke at length about this. But all these myths about millennials don't want to work is ridiculous. There's way more millennials in the workforce than there are my generation.
Right.
And there's no new boomers joining the workforce. So if we're not embracing an environment, a culture that is setting the millennials up for success, the agency's not. Right. No small businesses are set up for success.
I completely agree with you. Now, number two, you said social digital overall investment. Larger agencies seem to have more capital to invest in hiring the videographer and the blogger, and they run social media. They have more money to invest there. Talk a little bit about that number two. Meet the customer where they are, the investment in social digital platforms.
Yeah, what's interesting about that is certainly, yes, some of the large, the larger entities certainly have more capital.
Right.
I mean, this is just purely anecdotal, but it seems like the medium and the small to medium agencies are probably moving the needle here even more because they don't have the legacy expense structure to navigate. And
the multiple layers of middle management that have to make decisions relative to advertising and marketing budgets. I was explaining in an earlier podcast to Bradley, I said some of these insurance carriers, the way that small to mid-size and large insurance agencies have an advantage over them is, for a large carrier, it's like getting the Titanic out of the way of the iceberg, right? We're fluid. I can pick up my Android phone right now and record the best 66-second commercial that's ever been recorded in the history of mankind and stick it on Facebook and run ads on that, and 3 hours start getting insurance leads from that. Large carriers don't have that.
You're absolutely right, and really large brokers don't have that either. And they're focused on a different customer segment oftentimes. But if I'm not mistaken, you guys just had Scott Green on, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so Scott's in Ohio, and he's probably a poster child for that. And there are agencies agents doing what Scott does. And I was just at the IMCA conference, and Sid Rowe did a breakout session on this, and she showed a video done for $1,000 and one done for $100,000.
Right.
And the capabilities with a little bit of creativity and just roll up your sleeves and going and doing it is huge. And obviously, we could spend some time talking about the power of video today and helping tell your agency's culture, tell your agency's story. But the reality is, and we all know this, and I will still hear people combat this and say, well, I'm in a small town, I'm in a rural community, my customers aren't online. And I think we all know that's just not true anymore.
No.
And it just takes a willingness to step back and think and to be intentional about some of these things, because every customer is somewhere online. I don't even know what the statistic is anymore. Was it 70, 75, 80 some odd percent of all insurance buys start with some sort of an online search? So if you're not there, if you're not willing to tell your story, you aren't being found. And you're right, your customers aren't there. Everybody else's customers are.
I love that so much. So the last point on this topic.
Let me expand on that. Scott and I are going to Chattanooga, Tennessee in October to give a talk to the Young Agents Conference. Okay. Which I've never done a dual keynote before, especially with this guy. So we're really looking forward to it.
Wow.
We're actually going to be giving 2 talks. I think we're going to give one to the agents and one to the carriers.
Right.
I asked the gentleman that booked us, I said, well, what do you want us to talk about? He's like, look, we got all these agents, and majority of them sell commercial insurance, and they don't think that you can sell commercial insurance on social media. Like, this is the Young Agents Conference, like, let alone the Agents Conference. Right. And I'm like, what do you think that the CEO of ABC Air Conditioning and Heating is not on social media? Like, come on. Like, yes, there's a way to do it. And I had a young man call me yesterday with the exact same question, no relation to the conference. And in about 5 minutes, we laid out a marketing plan for him, and he was like, oh, my God, I never thought of that.
Right.
So it can be done.
Oh, yeah.
You just have to be willing to do it. And the bottom line is a lot of agents and a lot of companies and a lot of big agencies are too scared to stick their neck out there and go after those people in the way they know they need to do it because they're scared they're going to fail. And they're scared of looking stupid.
Or they don't have time.
Or they don't have time, or their ego can't take the hit of, hey, I'm trying something new. You know? Sorry for the rant.
It's interesting. No, it's all right. I mean, the interesting thing is, and you try to have this conversation in a way that eases people through that, but it's not new anymore.
Right.
And it's proven that it works everywhere. I mean, there's a reason the entire industry is focusing on digitizing small commercial insurance. And every trend points to how many there are and how fragmented it is. But you think the average small business owner, I mean, they're doing their thing from 9 to 5 when most agencies are open. And it's not until the kids are in bed and they've had dinner, they've had some time with their spouse or whatever, they're kind of going to sit down and say, I got to screw around with my insurance right now.
Right.
And it might start with a search on whatever social media platform you want to pick, or just I'm just going to type this into Google and see what comes up. So, if you're not there, I mean, you might as well be nowhere.
Right.
And if you're going to be there and they're like, here's 14 things that show up in my Google feed, I mean, there's so many classes you can go to do, to do beginner level SEO and have a quick little video about, hey, I'm Brad or I'm Scott. This is what I do. This is what I focus on. I know these are your concerns. Give me a jingle tomorrow, or better yet, just click here and I'll call you.
So last but not least, I want to talk a little bit about the data and the analytics, because that's something that we really haven't touched on this podcast. Help me understand more, help these agents to understand more about what you mean by tracking the data and the analytics relative to, increasing success within your agency.
Yeah, a lot of it comes down, there's so many different ways to take the data thing, and that's why I still feel like it's still in its infancy compared to some of these other ones. But depending on the stuff that you consume in your free time, if you listen to, other podcasts or whatever, but you hear about what's going on with AI and the power of data and what's happening with some of the large social platforms and how data is the new currency. And that scares people as much, probably more than the rest of this stuff that we've talked about. But when you start to think about just the availability of third-party data now at very inexpensive costs, to start to marry it with what does your book of business look like? Where have you found the most success? What are your hit ratios? How do you start to really carve out what might be a niche that you don't even know you have? You can start to buy census data and other information from the states or different parties, just to start to marry these things together. So, you start to see this looking different ways. First of all, it's just really understanding your own book of business, from as simple as I hear agencies still arguing, I can't afford to lose any customers. So that's why they'll call on a Friday afternoon. We used to call them non-pay Fridays when I was on the underwriting leadership time side, because that's when all the customers that had canceled for non-pay that week got their paycheck and they were in their agency trying to get their policy reinstated. And if you had a conversation about, do you really understand that segment of your customer? How much time, effort, and energy you spend to keep it? Or would you be better off letting it go. So there's some elementary things along that line, but a lot of agencies don't fully understand the mix of their book. Are they maximizing the carriers they do business with, the appetites that the carriers have? Are they maximizing the revenue opportunities with the carriers they have, and really trying to sync up production along those ways? And then it starts to get, far and more robust when it comes to how do you start to really target your marketing, your producer compensation, geographies that you want to go into. We mentioned merger and acquisition. It could really help shape, do we have a better alignment for possible acquisition of another agency or another producer? And then you just get far more robust when you really start to understand the consumer behavior and aggregate all this data together with common definitions. It really is, the sky's the limit. So those are conversations I love because we have an opportunity to learn way more than we even have to offer back, and it just continues to aggregate that. So I'm with you. It's just one of those things that I would love to learn more about and we continue to talk about. But it started with large brokers. They're all trying to understand data and get it together and synthesize it, but it's more and more, it's smaller agencies really trying to understand their health, and it takes data and it takes some sophistication.
Well, and the tip of the spear on the agency side, as you probably well know, my friend in Great American, Seth Zaremba, coming up with Project Neon, which for those of you that don't know, I've watched a demo. That's the tip of the spear. So what you're going to see, and I'm speaking to the agents right now that are listening to this, what you're going to see over the course of the next 10 years is the advent of all of these management systems out there, beginning obviously with Project Neon, because that was the first one that's been, kind of invented. But you're going to continue to see AI become part of the agent's management system, so that you're going to know when somebody's out there shopping. You're going to know who's not in your book of business that maybe is somebody that needs another policy. Those things are coming, and they're not going to be here 20, 30 years from now. They're going to be here very shortly. And I think what will end up happening after Project Neon's released is you'll see a arms race of different management systems. This is only my opinion, but an arms race of agency management systems trying to incorporate AI into their management system as well. Chris, last thing I want to ask you before I let you go here. What is the one thing between agents and carriers that is the biggest disconnect that you see? Is there any one thing that you feel like, you spoke just briefly about it a moment ago. I'll summarize what you said. It seemed to me like you were saying, again, internal dialogue, but it seemed like you were saying that, to me, it seems like a lot of times agents don't take full advantage of a lot of what carriers have to offer. And maybe part of that is that they just don't know what a carrier has to offer.
Yeah, there's probably a lot to that. And they're probably, and I would just be, if I was to pick one of any five larger gaps out of the air, it wouldn't be any more relevant than the other. But good, open, honest communication between carrier and any individual agency or any group of agencies, I believe is paramount. I think what we sometimes on both sides or all sides of this can lose sight of is that we are still independent businesses. Carriers are independent businesses trying to achieve certain operational goals, growth, returns on their own investment, their own equity, making investments that they think are best for their long-term success. Every independent agency is doing the exact same things. Most of the time, those decisions align well. Sometimes they do not. So not viewing those things as adversarial, but realizing that at times a little healthy tension is not a bad thing.
Right.
And it should facilitate open dialogue so that everybody is in sync and we understand where we're going to go. And carriers, us, I would say included, we can be guilty of running 100 miles an hour or 0 miles an hour, I guess, depending on perspective, and might miss a communication or might under-communicate or miscommunicate. But I think the same can be said as well. And when you're a carrier working with, however many hundreds or thousands of independent agencies you work with, there are going to be gaps out there. And so I would just say, if you're thinking about your relationship with your carriers as basic human communication or communication between two entities. It's a two-way street. And I try to instill this in our team. It's easy to sort of kind of pull yourself in and get frustrated if you don't feel you're being communicated with. But the only person you can influence in a situation is yourself. Be willing to go 51% of the way.
Right.
And that goes across the board. So that might be a cop-out, but it usually comes down to communication, which can manifest itself in a better understanding and a better alignment about models and decisions, and we move on with life.
Chris, I want to communicate to you something. I want to tell you how much I appreciate you being on this podcast today, man. It means a lot. It really does. You know, one of these days, and I don't know where we're going to be together, but I want to take you to dinner, lunch, breakfast, coffee, caramels, whatever. And let's you and I sit down for about an hour and just have just get in the boat with each other and continue this conversation, because I want to learn more about you. I want to talk a little bit more about and I would love to have him back on the podcast, Bradley.
Absolutely.
And talk a little bit more about, you know, carrier agent relationships and those types of things. I would absolutely love to do that, man. I've really, really enjoyed talking to you today. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this thing up. Insurance agents from around the world, listen to me. We've got to do a better job of getting in the boat with our carrier partners, because that's really what they are. They're partners, right? And understanding what they want, need, and feel, and not just looking at it from our perspective, whatever that perspective is, and figuring out through the marketing reps, through the people that we know within these carrier organizations, how they can help us further, what resources they have out there to help us. I think we do a poor job of taking advantage of that, and I hope that we do a better job of that in the future. Guys, remember what I always say. Rewards come from action, not discussion. Get your ass out from behind that desk today and go out into the big bad world and sell insurance. Make money for your family, make money for your kids, your wife, your husband, your parents that are struggling out there today. Go make money for them. Write good business for the agencies that you represent, and write good business for the companies that you represent. Bradley Flowers, I love you.
Love you too, buddy.
Hey,
thanks, Chris.
Chris, I love you too,
Hey,
brother.
thank you, guys.
Hey, anytime, man. You come back on whenever you'd like, and I'd love to have you again. Guys, you are listening to the Insurance Guys podcast, and we'll be back real soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Insurance Guys podcast. If you need to know more about me or you need to get in touch with Scott, you can always reach me at theinsuranceguyonline.com or email me at iprotectins@gmail.com. And if you need to get in touch with Mr. Bradley Flowers, go to bradleyflowersinsurance.com or email him at bradley@saralandinsurance.com. Guys, we love you. Thank you so much for listening. We look forward to being with you again real soon on the next episode of The Insurance Guys.